Okay, everyone, let's get started. Welcome to the Zalora office. My name is Sylvia. I work here. If you have any questions about Zalora, there's a couple of people, also my colleagues, in the Zalora t-shirts. Please, come and if you have any questions, speak to us later. Welcome to Product Tank. Product Tank number 32. I'm very happy actually that we can host it here in this office because it's going to be probably the last event for the year, but also probably the last time that we can host you guys in this amazing space because we're going to move. So you're getting to enjoy another look. Really happy to see so many faces here, making it here despite the rain. And very special event for us. So we have another Mind the Product special as a preparation for the Mind the Product conference next year in March. So I hope you already all got your tickets. And if not, then check it out later tonight. The speakers for tonight are Rosemary and also Martin, who are from the Mind the Product team. Based in London, but actually now traveling through Southeast Asia and a bit of Australia as well, and stopping by here in Singapore. So yeah, give them a round of applause for joining us tonight. So the first talk is actually Rosemary is going to be presenting, and it's the signal through the noise, how mapping helps product teams.
Thank you.
Let me hand it over to you.
Amazing.
Rosemary. Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's mine. Yeah, perfect. So I'm double mic'd right now. I have to hold a mic, and I'm wearing a mic, and it's a lot of mics. So welcome. We love coming to Mind the Product. I don't know if this turned off or, yeah. It's fun. We love coming to Singapore. It's one of our favorite places. I can also, just down. Okay, pointed down. Thank you. We love coming to Singapore. It's one of our favorite destinations. We love coming back a couple times a year, and it's become a wonderful city that I love to explore. So it's really happy to be here and see so many wonderful faces. So as Sylvia said, my talk is called The Signal and the Noise, How Mapping Helps Product Teams Find the Right Story. And I'm going to kick off with a quick public service announcement, which is that actually this talk is very much a work in progress. One of the things that I like modeling because I'm a trainer. I teach a lot of product practice, and I think a lot of people think that giving a talk means that you have to have a very polished, very finished, very perfect talk. But actually, product tanks are a wonderful place where you can work out ideas. So Martin and Annalisa told me about 3 weeks ago that I was going to be doing a talk here at Product Tank, and I had had this idea for this talk for quite a while, so it was a wonderful excuse to get some of my ideas down on paper. So you are about to see iteration 1. So I'd love your feedback, I love your questions, and it's really going to help me point to what iteration 2 is going to look like. But also remember that you can all get up here and kind of chuck a bunch of ideas up on the screen and put it out to the community and say, what did you think? And then use that to help you iterate towards the next version. So again, my name is Rosemary King. I am the director of training products, but before I joined Mind the Product as a member of the core team, I was a product manager for almost 10 years, and I built software. And then I moved over to the MTP team and became what I call a service designer. But it was really fascinating because when I joined the MTP team 3 years ago, my life changed dramatically. Dramatic pause. So what you guys have just experienced is called a point of change. And points of change are extremely powerful mechanisms in storytelling. All about how we as product managers need to focus on these specific points of change and use them to get people to pay attention and to also focus the work that you guys do. So you probably wanted to know when I said my life changed dramatically, a couple of things. What did folks want to know? Yell it out. What do we think?
How did it change?
How did it change? What else? What has changed? So points of change in the story mechanism create questions. They make people lean forward and say, wait, what? What happened? What's going on? And that's exactly what you want your stakeholders at your organizations to do when you want them to pay attention to you. So points of change are super important for us as product managers. So some product points of change that we can think of. One, maybe you see a dramatic rise in usership, or all of a sudden, like, use of a specific feature has doubled. Or negatively, you could see a massive drop in activity, like conversions. Those are what you can characterize as points of it's okay, as points of change. And these are things that actually really basically drive a lot of our actions as PMs. So what do points of change do? Points of change shape our focus, aka they make people lean forward and say, what's happening? 2, they represent unexpected or possible danger. So this is very much kind of our pre-evolutionary brain, like fight or flight mode. Like when something is unknown, it automatically represents something that we fear, or something that could be potentially dangerous to us as product teams or organizations. 3, change represents hope. The idea that something could change means that it could get better, that it could improve, that there's an opportunity that we didn't see before. So change is a really, really important mechanism for us as we look at iterating and building our products moving forward. And again, as I mentioned, the point of change in a story is an incredibly powerful alignment tool. Because if nothing ever changes, then why do your stakeholders pay attention to you? So being able to focus the conversation around points of change is actually really important for us as product managers to think about. So what do we need to do with points of change? Like, that's the next question. Once you've identified a point of change or thought about it, how do you work with it? How does it become a story? How does it go from a single point in time or a single bad situation or a potential situation to something that we can then work with and create an action plan around? And that's what we do by asking and expanding questions around that point of change. So what's happening around it? What caused it? What are the effects, the costs? How serious? What does it affect? So asking these questions is actually a process or a practice called systems thinking. So systems thinking is actually a very technical way of describing the building of a story for you as a product manager. And it's fascinating. I was having a conversation with a guy called Jeremy. Where's Jeremy? Hi, Jeremy. Annalisa and I were just having a conversation with Jeremy before we all kicked off. And he was talking about how his company is incredibly complex, and his product is incredibly complex, and his organization is incredibly complex. And all of us as product managers exist in an ecosystem of dozens and dozens of complex systems. And we need to figure out how we make sense of them, how they interconnect, their dependencies. And so systems thinking is an incredibly powerful practice for us to understand as product people who are attempting to make things better. So the question is where do you start? I would like everyone to do a little bit of an exercise with me. So make a thumb like this. Now touch your nose with your thumb and try to look at your thumb, like with both eyes. Try to look at your thumb. So what do you see here? You see kind of the hazy outline of your thumb, and then nothing else is in focus either, right? So imagine your thumb is your point of change. Now, keep your thumb there. Now slowly but surely extend your arm while continuing to look at your thumb. Keep going, go as far as you can. Now all of a sudden, your thumb becomes crystal clear, and you can make sense of what's around your thumb. So that process is called basically getting on the balcony. So as soon as you give yourself distance, like all of us are pressed up against our products like this every day. We're with our teams every day. We're with our orgs every day. And it's really hard to focus when something is that close to our face, right? You can't see it. So what you have to do is you have to give yourself permission to get distance from the thing you're attempting to examine. So that practice is metaphorically called getting on the balcony. But how we actually get on the balcony is you build models, you map stuff, you build maps. Who here has done any kind of mapping exercise? Has anyone mapped anything? You know, Annalisa has, Martin has. That's because I make them. So mapping is basically when you create a physical model of the system that you're attempting to examine. And you do it with a group of diverse subject matter experts, your stakeholders, your team members, and you figure out the information you need to extract. So let's talk about this and think about this a little bit more specifically, because mapping is such an incredibly important practice for product managers to think about and understand. So putting it into context, say your customers are leaving your site. A bunch of people are coming to visit, but none of them are doing what you want them to actually do. They're not converting or they're not engaging. And so you don't necessarily understand why. So what you do in order to start this mapping process is you think, okay, well, we don't understand why our customers aren't doing what we want them to do on our site. So you create a list of questions, and there are probably lots of questions that you could ask. So start of some of these questions are, why are they leaving? Why isn't it compelling for them to actually do what you want them to do? What about your value proposition is missing? Do they understand the value prop? Do they understand what to do? Is there a challenge or friction point that makes them leave? So again, the list of questions that you could ask probably, that you would ask if you examine a point of change and say, what questions does this create? Where are there unknown unknowns for us? But you can't answer all the questions at one point, and nor should you try with a map. Trying to use your map to answer all your questions is basically going to make your map pretty useless, because again, what you're looking to do is avoid brain overload. So you have to focus. So generally, I recommend picking the top 1 or 2 questions that you can answer that are most important for you to answer up front. So the questions dictate the focus of your map. So if your question was, why are our customers leaving our site? There are a lot of different ways in which you can create a map that could help answer that question. So again, we teach an 8-hour mapping workshop, and I think in the workshop talk about like 34 or 40 different kinds of maps that you could build. So you could focus on the customer and their ups and downs, which I think is probably a really great way of understanding sort of their experience with your tool. So that's one type of map. It's called a customer journey map. 2, you could focus on all the interactions that your service has with the customer, which might be really interesting. This is called a service blueprint. And basically, instead of just mapping the customer journey, you map all of the different interaction points that your company has, the different touch points that go with the customer. Or maybe it's something to do with your team and org. Maybe there's a lot of friction in that, and you're having a really hard time getting improvements out to your customer that would help their experience. So maybe it's your team and org that's causing the friction. Probably not, though, because you probably need to start first with understanding your customer. Or you could focus on how your org interacts with other orgs. Maybe you're doing a big B2B thing, and your B2B is really tricky, and you don't understand why it's not working in terms of how you interact. So this is literally the tip of the iceberg. But the one thing that's really important is that I would not recommend trying to shove all the information that you could capture in each one of these maps in a single map. Because again, basically that means you'd come in and look at a whole, big vomit of information and not be able to parse the actual problem. So the key here is removing information is often more valuable than adding it to maps. I think a lot of times I've seen people try to do maps where they're just like, all the information. That's not the point of maps. The point of maps is to focus on answering the top number 1 problem question that you need to answer. So again, that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's a tiny little sliver of the types of maps that you could build that would help you get on that balcony. So just to wrap up, a couple of things that I'd love for you guys to start thinking about is, if you don't know the concept of systems thinking, check into it. There's a couple of really amazing talks on YouTube from the Center for Disease Control, all about the value of systems thinking. Find a couple of articles or blogs on how mapping is basically systems thinking in practice. Think about the points of change that you're experiencing right now. Where are your problem or friction points with your product that you have questions about, that you're not really sure about, that you'd love to build a map around? Think about the questions that you'd love to answer first, and finally, think about how the questions would dictate that focus. So just a quick wrap up and things that you can take away with you tonight when you're trying to fall asleep and you can't. So to wrap up, if you're really interested, so this is basically a talk that discusses one of our day-long workshops called Product Mapping. If you're interested in bringing any of our workshops to Singapore, you can sign up and register your interest here at www.mindtheproduct.com/Kickstarter. So you can say come to Singapore. We do come at least twice a year. We are offering, I believe, 4 of our workshops around our Singapore conference. So if this has been interesting to you or you like the way that we present ideas, check out tickets for those. And if you have questions for me, you can find me on Twitter. And I think we're also going to do a brief Q&A as well. So I hope that this was helpful. Oh, so scary. Okay.
I think we can do the Q&A.
Do you want to do the Q&A now?
Rosemary?
Okay, yeah, perfect, amazing. I'd love to take immediate questions. Let's do it. Perfect. Who's got questions? Got a question there?
The point of change similar to hypothesis in other models, like the startup of the hypothesis.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question. And I think points of change, in my opinion, can probably create hypotheses. So when you observe that change and you have questions about it, that's when you say, well, we're observing that customers are leaving the site. And you can absolutely have a hypothesis around what's going on with that. And yeah, absolutely. You can use that to sort of frame your experiment for sure. And that's actually a skip. You know, the in-between step of mapping is sometimes when you don't even have a hypothesis. Like you can't even come up with a hypothesis. So if you can skip the mapping section and go straight to the hypothesis, that's a really good thing. That's super positive. Other questions?
So how new or old is this concept, and are there any other ways of identifying, are there any other ways of doing this? Why did you come up with system thinking, and what's...
Oh, I did not come up with systems thinking, but thank you so much for thinking that I did. Systems thinking is actually a very old practice. It came up when systems that had great complexity started being created around the Industrial Revolution in the mid 18th century. But basically, I think what I'm seeing, and the reason why Mind the Product is talking about systems thinking so much, is because in today's day and age, we're experiencing so much more complexity than we have at any other point in history. We are all inherently global organizations. Our customers exist in incredibly complex systems where information is flying at their face at a speed that we've never before seen. And I think in order for product managers to give themselves a little bit of a crutch and a support system, I think systems thinking is becoming really necessary. Again, we can't hold all this information in our minds. And so the concept of thinking about systems and using mapping as a practice is a massive assist as we try to understand and parse complexity. Does that answer your question a little bit?
I just wanted to know, why is it become so very important today? What are the other cruder ways of doing it, and what are the advantages it brings to it?
I mean, the interesting thing about mapping is that it doesn't have to be a really complex system. I mean, sometimes a map is as simple as structuring an email or building an organized backlog. Sometimes it's just about sketching, a process flow up on a whiteboard. And we actually talk about this in our workshop. It doesn't have to be something that's really arduous. Sometimes if you're really attempting to break apart and break down a really complex problem, it's nice to have a real session, on a wall with a lot of Post-it notes and a team full of subject matter experts. That's great. But sometimes if it's just you and a designer or you and a dev, kind of jotting stuff down on a whiteboard, that's also mapping. So I think high and low, but I think the mindset of mapping and visualizing how things flow is what I hope product managers get comfortable with, if that makes sense. Any other questions? Hello.
Hi, I'm Nish.
Hello.
So I practiced in my past about what are the empathy mapping. Empathy map with the user emotions, and we do that empathy mapping.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any because on the consumer product it really works well where you can get a lot of data points. The product we are working with more of an enterprise solution where people come every day and do their tasks. Is there any technique you find to optimize capture day by day and have optimized flow using empathy mapping?
So just so I can repeat the question so I know I understand it. So you're building an enterprise system where users kind of have to use the product. And so you're asking how to map their emotions, even though they're kind of not your typical end user?
Yes, they are the end user because they are all
They're the end user, yeah. So it's all about, you want to know kind of how to map their emotions. Yeah, so I think, I mean, I can flip back to this slide and sort of talk a little bit about this map, which is a good visual indication of this. So basically, you know, this is the simplest version of a customer journey map, and I think basically what you would do is you would put your customer here, and basically it would be all of the action points or tasks that your customer needs to accomplish through the course of using the product, or it could be through the course of their day. Like, that's something that I find really interesting, is you could do everything that they do in the course of their day, and then you could, in a different color, map each time they use your product in a different color. And this is why I love Post-it notes, because you can just use, it's so simple to kind of like create visual ways of making it easier to view all of these things. Just pick a different color. So, you know, every task that they take up throughout the day, then how they use their product in a different color. And then what you could do down here is you can sort of say, put a green Post-it note every time it feels like they're happy when they accomplish something. And then maybe put a red Post-it note every time they're challenged or frustrated. And then what you can do is, like, when you step back from that, it's always nice to bring a customer in to let them fill that out as well. Really nice. And then all you have to do is step back and say, where are their clusters of challenges and friction? And you have your priority in terms of if you want to improve and know where to focus, which is really nice. Yeah, and again, like, there are so many different ways to structure user journey maps. This is just one way. Yes?
So how do you define friction when you're mapping?
There are tons of different ways to do it. I tend to do it with different colored Post-it notes. I sort of say like red or pink because they pop out of the other colors.
I think what I mean is,
how
do you know something is a friction in the whole system?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, generally, I use certain touch points. I don't know how often you speak to your customers directly. Do you ever? Never. So that definitely makes it really tricky to understand where there's friction and challenges. In my experience, I've come from a very user research oriented background, and so I tend to advocate in my practice that my org has to let me have contact with customers, because it's in those customer interviews or shadowing sessions, when I go into the field and I shadow my customers and watch them work, which I've done in the past, or I've brought them in for interviews. And I talk to them and ask them to describe their current experience. And oftentimes I just point blank ask them, what frustrates you right now? Or, walk me through the course of your day. And when I hear them say, yeah, I really hated that, I said, tell me more about that. What do you hate about it? So I tend to let users really dictate challenges and frustration. But again, as you can see, there's lots of different ways in mapping that you can characterize friction. So sometimes if you're doing process maps, it's where there's dependencies or friction between teams. Sometimes there can be friction between huge organizations in terms of resources and things like that. So friction can be defined in a lot of different ways. When it comes to customer journey maps, I think it's really great when you can let your customer define friction. So sometimes some easy ways of being able to define friction if you don't yet have access to your customers is, do you have customer service desks? Do people put in tickets? Can you do data polls on where people are making the most complaints? So that's sometimes a really great way of starting to get at the customer voice if you're not quite yet have a clear pathway to speaking to customers. And then when you sort of see value from that and that helps define priority, you can then use that to advocate for things like customer interviews, etc. Yeah. Back?
So that's the hardest bit I find outsourcing to my team.
The hardest thing, speaking to, yeah.
Time is the biggest constraint. As much as I would love to shadow or do it myself, that's the hardest one, and I can't outsource it. Generally, it's nothing. I'm assuming if your face the same, how do you solve for it?
That's a really great question, and I totally bow to that, because it is super difficult to constantly make time for consistent user research. In general, what I find really helpful is by sharing the load. So I have had the great fortune of being able to work very collaboratively with user experience designers who are huge collaborators with me on the process. The other thing that I've also found super helpful is what I call research operations. So same as DevOps, like developers create all of these wonderful tools so that they don't have to do the same thing manually every time. So I think I think there's a big trend in product right now to think about operationalizing practices so that you can create manual labor gains, if that makes sense. So I would always try at the start of any project to think about, okay, how often do I want to run research? And what are the processes I need to bake into place so that it's not so difficult every time for me to do this? A wonderful, amazing woman called Dana Towsey, Towsey, has incredible resources on research operations. But it's all basic. You have to think about deploying research the same way that devs think about deploying code. It's all about minimizing risk, maximizing efficiency, and making sure that it doesn't take up your whole time. It will take up time, but if you can find gains, then you're golden. So, yeah. Do we have time? How many more questions do we have time for? One more? Okay, one more. Hi.
So in terms of customer interviews versus Zendesk tickets, which would you find it more better to get feedback from? Because customer interviews, maybe you might train them, in a certain way.
Yeah.
In Zendesk tickets, they're just firing at you.
I'm going to give you a real frustrating answer. Are you ready for this one? Yes. Both. Do you want to know why? Because the Zendesk tickets are what I would characterize as quantitative data. So that's hopefully large chunks of data that you can pull from your customer service. And what quantitative data gives you is the what. So if I was to try to answer a question and say, what were my customers' biggest challenges this month? I would extrapolate that from the tickets that I got sent in. So of all the tickets, 80% of them talked about how they couldn't find the button to start. So then I would go and say, okay, now I'm going to do 5 customer interviews to help me understand why. The why is what you get out of the qualitative. And qualitative can still add up to quantitative. So that's the thing, is we advocate that you start doing customer interviews and you never really stop. So initially you might get data and say 4 out of the 5 of our interviews said X. They said that finding the button to start was the most important thing. And then if your boss still doesn't let you work on that, then you keep going, and then you say 9 out of 10. And then you say actually 14 out of 15 interviews have now all said this is their biggest problem. It's hard to necessarily refute that at that stage. So I really believe in finding the balance between quantitative and qualitative data. And they both have incredibly strong utility when it comes to helping you prioritize and answer questions. That's the thing about research, is that it takes the burden off our shoulders to make all of these decisions. Let the customer break the tie, so to speak. Cool. Awesome. Thank you guys. These were great questions. This was really, really fun. We could do this all night. It was super fun. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rosemary.
Oh, my pleasure.
Okay, let's take a quick 5-minute break. So there's